Blackwood Asylum, heavy as ink. Not even the moon could pierce the sky's thick, dark shroud. It was as if nature itself had drawn an impenetrable curtain over the cursed structure's secrets, hiding them from everyone. When Jonathan switched off the headlights of his old model Jeep, the silence that enveloped him was as loud as an ear-splitting scream, the final echo of the madness trapped within those walls years ago had begun to resonate in his ears. Jonathan's reason for coming to this dilapidated place was simple: a story. He was preparing a podcast series about forgotten and abandoned places, and Blackwood was to be the series' climax. Facing fear, recording it, and letting people listen was a challenge he had set for himself. This process had quickly become his passion. But now, stepping out of the safe haven of his car, his curiosity was replaced by a cold, sharp shiver. This was more than just an old building. It was utterly abandoned. Its walls clearly reflected the suffering of years past to its visitors. It looked as if it were coated in the invisible plaster of the agony endured within. When the steel door groaned open, protesting against its rusted hinges, Jonathan shone his flashlight inside. The smell of mold, dampness, dust, and strangely disinfectant burned his nostrils. It was as if someone had tried to cleanse all the evil here years ago but failed. The entrance hall was as majestic as it was somber. The pendulum, which he recognized as the skeleton of a once magnificent crystal chandelier, was an ironic monument to the past. The peeling paint on the walls revealed remnants of cheerful yellow and orange colors underneath. Clearly, these colors had been chosen to illuminate the darkness in the patients' minds, but had been unsuccessful. After a few steps, Jonathan pulled the recording equipment from his backpack. As he set up the tripod, an unnerving gaze seemed to watch him. It saw his every move, every bead of sweat, and the tremor deep within his soul. Jonathan's logic was strong. He knew the feeling of being watched was just an illusion. He did not believe in the supernatural. His only belief was in the dark labyrinths of the human mind. This adventure was a social experiment for him. He wanted to show people that fear was merely a simple mind game. He had always done so up until now. All the abandoned places he had visited proved that what was inside was not a ghost, but the manifestation of a worn-out human psyche. However, the game Blackwood had prepared for him tonight was nowhere to be found in any psychology book. Jonathan was self-assured, his confidence reflected in his steps. When he pressed the record button, he gave a brief, simple description of the area as he took a short tour. He planned to sweep the entire building step by step. After passing the reception desk, he continued. As he approached the building's floor plan, he heard a faint click coming from the left of the long corridor. Stopping and focusing, Jonathan thought it was the sound of a small stone falling. When he turned his flashlight towards the sound, the pitch-black corridor lit up. He saw that both sides of the long passage were lined with countless doors enclosed by iron bars. Each one was a patient's room. A careful inspection showed that the bars were once stained with the fingerprints of despair. Jonathan turned his gaze back to the map and muttered into the recording device, "Ground floor, dormitories, and administrative offices." Still an incredibly silent place. It's as if the building has absorbed even the energy of sound. At that very moment, he heard a whisper from the depths of the corridor. It resembled a human voice, yet lacked words. It was as if a lost soul was trying to whisper the most terrifying secrets with its last breath. Jonathan froze solid. For a moment, the foundation of all his beliefs was shaken to the core, as fear, like an insidious smoke, seeped into his body. He knew there was no going back. He positioned the recording device to capture the same sound again. He was slightly unnerved, but lacked the courage to admit it to himself. "Who's there?" Jonathan called out, trying to control the tremor in his voice. He wasn't expecting an answer. In his belief, an answer was impossible anyway. A few seconds later, the fear sparked again. Now, he heard not just one whisper, but a multitude of them. They seemed to come from the ceilings, the walls, and beneath the floor tiles. A chorus of incomprehensible words was rapidly approaching him. Jonathan's logic quickly worked to explain the situation. The wind, the building settling, the old ventilation system. But the whispers had a rhythm. It was as if someone wanted to talk to him, but couldn't articulate it. With his heart pounding against his ribcage, he scanned the corridor with his flashlight. Nothing. No shadow, no movement, no crack in a door. The whispers suddenly stopped with a clear shh sound. The hairs on the back of Jonathan's neck stood up. He quickly switched off the recording device. It was obvious that surviving was more important than recording right now. Something that had been watching him since he entered the building, something ancient and malevolent, was aware of him, and it had no intention of leaving him alone within these walls. He began to gather his belongings. Because he had dropped his tripod and a few other items in his panic, he reluctantly bent down and knelt. He froze when a sound came from above his head. Slowly, he got up and raised his head and flashlight. In the farthest corner of the ceiling, he saw a dark patch formed by dampness. The tiny stain slowly changed and began to take shape. It now looked like the head and shoulders of a human figure. But as Jonathan's eyes fixed on it, the stain slowly vanished. It was as if the silent building was coming to life. Jonathan knew that night he would encounter neither a patient nor a doctor in Blackwood. The thing living there was a being beyond time and space, and this entity had turned the asylum into its own fortress. The dark silhouette was waiting for him on the path to the entrance door. That was why his only option was to climb to the second floor. He walked quickly toward the stairs, occasionally glancing behind him. Every step shattered the silence. He was no longer just chasing a story. Now, he was looking for a way to get out of here alive. And in the corridor he left behind, those incomprehensible whispers had begun again, but this time in a lower, more threatening tone. As Jonathan climbed the marble stairs to the second floor, every step he took made the building's soul creak. The whispers from the first floor were left behind, replaced now by a colder, sharper silence. This floor was the asylum's heart, the location of the private care rooms, administrative offices, and Dr. Silas Blackwood's personal office. The atmosphere here was different from the moldy, general despair of the ground floor. This was where individual terror and the deepest secrets were kept. Jonathan swept his flashlight across the long, high-ceilinged corridor. Naive, childlike paintings, hung years ago to cheer up patients, now hung faded and torn on the walls. A half-ripped picture of a clown dangled from the wall, its empty eyes staring directly at Jonathan. "All right, Jonathan," he whispered to himself. "This is an old building. Sounds, the wind, they can be explained." But as Jonathan's logic center formed this defense, his senses screamed a completely different reality. Someone else was here. Those whispers were not the work of the wind. They were an interaction directly aimed at him. It was as if something was trying to talk to him. Or perhaps it was after him to kill him. Jonathan was not yet sure of this entity's intentions. When he finally reached the second floor, the ajar door on the left caught his eye. A name, mostly erased, was inscribed on the brass plate above it. Dr. S. Blackwood, Chief Physician. Jonathan slowly pushed the door open. The room was a place where time had frozen. Leather armchairs, a large dusty oak desk, and a small bookshelf lined with worn books decorated the room. The swivel chair by the window was tilted slightly to the side, as if someone had just gotten up. Jonathan approached the desk. Everything was cluttered, with traces of work that had been hastily abandoned. The faint light of his flashlight fell onto a leather-bound journal. Jonathan reached out his hand, but hesitated just before touching it. Right next to the journal on the desk, a single red pen stood, its tip sharp and its ink looking fresh, as if it had been used a short time ago. Jonathan knew that this asylum had been abandoned for over 20 years. Nevertheless, he picked up the pen and turned it between his fingers. It was cold, but not damp. His logic vehemently objected to what was happening. Perhaps the pen was used by a vagrant, or maybe another fear enthusiast. But why would a vagrant enter the chief physician's office of an asylum just to use a pen? Finally, he dared to pick up the leather-bound journal. Blackwood's handwriting was initially neat and academic. Patient 412, high paranoia, treatment, shock, and isolation. But as the pages progressed, the handwriting became more rushed, more chaotic. When he reached the last page, Jonathan's breathing quickened. The page was written with a dark brown fluid instead of ink, and the content was far removed from any medical record. It walks in the corridors. It consumes not only our minds but also the light. I will no longer call it a being. It is a void that absorbs light. 412 does not see it, but senses it. And I too have begun to talk to it. It whispered only one sentence to me: accept me. The text ended there. At the very bottom of the page, scrawled in large, uneven letters, as if hastily scribbled, was only one word: W-E. The red pen in Jonathan's hand suddenly adhered to his fingers with an incredible coldness. It was a coldness so intense that it felt as if not his skin, but his bone marrow was covered in ice. He immediately threw the pen onto the desk. The dull sound echoed in the empty room. As the red pen slowly rolled toward the last page of Blackwood's journal, the office door slowly shut by itself. The creaking door sent a shockwave through his entire body. His heart raced, cold sweat poured from his forehead, and his hands could no longer carry his bag. Panic was literally crushing his logic, forcing him to act impulsively. When his instincts finally won the battle, he ran to the door and turned the handle. He was locked inside. No, this isn't real. Impossible, Jonathan shouted, pushing the door with his shoulder, but it wouldn't budge. The solid wooden door was too strong for him. Jonathan was still fumbling with the door lock when a muffled clatter was heard from behind the office chair. He immediately stopped breathing. It was as if all the oxygen in the room had suddenly vanished. He was either having a panic attack, or the entity he had recently seen wanted to burn his lungs. Dr. Blackwood's swivel chair had slowly begun to turn on its own. At first, it only moved a few centimeters. Finally, it stopped, with its back toward Jonathan. There was nothing on the chair's seat, but the dusty leather had depressed, as if someone was sitting on it. Jonathan pointed his flashlight with a trembling hand at the chair. The sight he saw was one of only emptiness. Yet he was certain that someone was sitting there, watching him. He had felt this sensation of being watched when he first entered the building. What he had dismissed as just a shiver was now clearly in front of him, staring. From behind the locked door, those familiar whispers from the depths of the corridor began again, but this time the sounds did not come from a single direction. They echoed, filtered through the walls, enveloping the room like a net from ceiling to floor. Jonathan's heart wasn't just beating in his chest, it was hammering. The whispers first repeated those old, muffled words that were incomprehensible. Then, slowly and almost carefully, they began to spell out Jonathan's own name. Jonathan. With every syllable, the air grew colder, and the flashlight flickered slightly. It was as if one of the walls was breathing. From another place, a tone that sounded almost like a child's voice rose. Jonathan now knew that this was not just a trick of his mind. He was sure the whispers were not the sound of the wind. It wasn't an echo either. It was a sound that touched the most sensitive corner of Jonathan's mind, directly on his nerve endings. This was a call, not from the asylum's soul, but from the entity itself. It had found him. It had cornered him, alone and defenseless, in a locked room. Moreover, it knew his name and was softly calling out to him. Jonathan pressed his back against the wall. His breath was ragged, and the sweat trickling down his forehead was cold. He dropped the flashlight and covered his face with trembling hands. The light from the flashlight rotated in a circle on the floor, causing shadow silhouettes to dance on the walls. Even with his eyes closed, he saw two red points sitting in the void of that chair in the darkness. The red light reflecting from the otherworldly being's eyes was etched into Jonathan's brain. This restless entity was not just a ghost or an echo of the past. That thing had seeped out from between the lines of Dr. Blackwood's journal. Every sentence, every word was a call. Jonathan now realized the meaning of that call. The entity was not just feeding on fear. Terror was merely a door for it. What it truly desired was the thing behind that door, acceptance, to be recognized by a living mind, to find a place inside a body. Jonathan slowly pulled his hands from his face. The light filtering through his fingers was no longer the flashlights, but the red glows. The entity was not speaking, but Jonathan had begun to hear. Within everything, reverberating in the folds of his own thoughts, there was a single voice. Accept me. Jonathan went over the words written in the journal again in his mind. Blackwood had somehow succumbed to this being he had summoned. The entity had taken over the poor man's body and shattered his soul. And now, the one holding the red pen, just as Blackwood had done years ago, was Jonathan. Jonathan's name echoing in his mind rang like a siren. The two red eyes hovering over the chair were the only source of color in the dark air surrounding the room. Clearly, this was not just an avenging ghost. It was the confluence of pure, cold, and hungry rage. Trapped, Jonathan succumbed to panic, leaving logic behind. The only thing left was the primal instinct for survival. He knew the door was locked. That's why he looked toward the nearest window. The ground was 2 floors down, and the sharp teeth of the broken glass guaranteed injury. Even if he survived the jump, if he was too injured to run, he wouldn't have time to escape the asylum grounds. He immediately discarded the idea of jumping. Just as new ideas began to sprout in his mind, he heard a chilling sound. The sound came not from the chair or the wall, but from the tile floor. It was as if someone was clawing the floor with nails, and was dragging itself towards Jonathan. The invisible thing, which had shoved the chair and table to the side of the room, had begun to drag itself faster than before. "Stay away," Jonathan hissed, his voice cracking and catching in his throat. It had actually worked. The entity stopped. It wasn't rushing, but was savoring its first prey to fall into its clutches after so many years. Jonathan was completely plastered against the wall. A feeling washed over him that he could liquefy and pass through it. At that moment, the wall behind the chair began to bleed. A metallic scent stung his nose as the redness started to spread across the entire wall. The color slowly flowed as if the wall was sweating. 1 drop, 2 drops. They fell to the floor, forming a tiny pool. Then the flow accelerated and the red began to spread throughout the room. This was the exact tone of the dreadful brown fluid in Dr. Blackwood's journal. As the drops began to form a distinct shape on the floor, Jonathan realized he had dropped his flashlight in fear. He immediately picked up the flashlight and brought it closer to the cluster of drops. The interwoven words on the floor were simple but utterly sickening. "We are here." Jonathan stepped backward. Terror took control of his body. He had only one thought in his mind: escape. The rest of his mind went silent. Only the instinct for survival was screaming with its last strength. His eyes scanned the surroundings, forming a quick plan. He spotted the heavy brass stapler on the desk and snatched it. The coldness of the metal in his fingers felt like it was burning his palms. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, he rushed to the locked door and swung the stapler with all his might at the lock mechanism. The brass weapon collided with the rusted metal, echoing with a deafening noise. The first blow failed. With the second, a sound resembling a moan was heard from behind the door. On the third blow, the old lock finally gave up. The door ripped off its rotten hinges and flew outwards. Jonathan threw himself into the corridor, his heart pounding wildly. The cold air filled his lungs, but even breathing was painful. His flashlight trembled in his hand. The light illuminated the faded paintings on the walls piece by piece. Every wall the light hit revealed the silhouette of a non-existent person. The walls were covered with suffering faces, and each one was watching him. The lower jaws of some were unnaturally hanging down toward the floor. It was as if they were screaming with all their might, begging for help. He couldn't even hear the sound of his own footsteps as he ran. That was because his heartbeats were drumming on his eardrums, deafening him with an unbearable buzzing. "Run, just run, don't look back," he repeated to himself. But at that moment, the sound of glass breaking from behind silenced all his thoughts. The window he had considered jumping from was shattered. Jonathan didn't stop, yet he couldn't help but turn his head, succumbing to his curiosity. When the flashlight beam hit the end of the corridor, he saw something dragging itself from behind the office door. It was no longer a shadow. It had taken on a much denser, much more vivid shape. As it moved on the floor, it rubbed against the walls, leaving a burnt trail behind. When its sharp claws became visible under the light, the mortal fear Jonathan was trying to suppress grew steadily, and his heart felt like it would burst out of his chest. The entity was no longer just following him. It was close. Jonathan was now certain. This devilish entity not only wanted to chase him, but also to possess him. Running at top speed across the slippery floor, he left several corridors behind. Slowing down to catch his breath, he noticed an empty stretcher standing diagonally across from him. As Jonathan was about to pass the stretcher, he saw a dry, blackened handprint on the sheet. The print was not an ordinary smudge of dust. It was as if someone had touched the sheet with a dirty hand, leaving a trace of ash behind. Jonathan slowed his run and illuminated the area under the stretcher with his flashlight. Intermittent blood traces, starting from the stretcher and leading toward a larger, double-doored room on the right side of the corridor, looked like a map. The traces progressed irregularly on the floor, suggesting that someone had dragged themselves in agony. Seeing these traces, Jonathan remembered the story of Patient 412 in Blackwood's journal. Dr. Blackwood had spoken of a void that swallowed light. Now, Jonathan understood better that the traces proved how dangerous that horrifying void truly was. Following the bloody traces, he stopped in front of the double doors. The rusted metal door plate was still legible. Cell Block B, Isolation and Treatment. Jonathan pushed the doors open without hesitation. As he stepped inside, he felt the cold air penetrate his lungs. It was at least 10 degrees colder inside than outside. The room resembled a large ward. In the center stood a heavy metal table used to restrain patients. However, the edges were surrounded by small cells with thick steel doors, unlike the other rooms. Rust stains and faded numbers covered the walls. This place had witnessed agony and despair for many years. Jonathan had been forced to come here. The blood traces had led him this far. But unlike the fresh whispers in the corridor, this place was shrouded in absolute silence. It was such a silence that Jonathan felt his own breathing, like a suffocating weight. The echo of his footsteps vanished under the metal table, drowning in the emptiness around him. He approached the table. The blood traces ended at the table's leg. Leaning over the table surface, he noticed a message written in red pen. Jonathan pointed his flashlight at the table. The flickering beam illuminated the writing. The writing carried a much more complex, much more personal expression than the word "we" in Dr. Blackwood's journal. They refused to understand me. They were blind and foolish. I tore their useless bodies apart so I could become whole. My only wish was to possess a living body like yours. They were too ignorant to give me what I wanted. Now, you have come, Jonathan. Can you see us? Whatever this thing was, it was trying to communicate with Jonathan. It had torn apart everyone who stopped and didn't listen to it. But Jonathan knew that if he stopped, it would take over his body. Confused, Jonathan glanced at the writing again. He was looking for a clue that would save him from this situation. The only thing he found was more confusion. The devilish entity referred to itself as "we." Probably the people hadn't been able to leave the building years ago and had become the entity's prisoners. This was a living cemetery. Jonathan chose to do his best rather than stop and waste time. He quickly scanned his surroundings. In the center of the room on the table lay a single human tooth. It looked white, clean, and fresh, as if it had fallen just seconds ago. As Jonathan's eyes locked onto the tooth, a wave of acid began to rise in his stomach. It climbed up to his throat, taking his breath away. This was not the work of a vagrant. This was not a ghost story either. This was something real. The presence of the tooth on the table, the silence in the room, the darkness of the corridors, all whispered that an entity was trying to achieve a physical form. Blackwood Asylum's cold, rusty walls had now become the devil's home. At that moment, a giggle rose from every corner of Cell Block B. It was a high-pitched, thin child's voice, but it echoed from so many mouths. Jonathan heard the sound as if it was shattering his brain into pieces. His ears buzzed. and his own blood felt like it was trying to drain out of his body with violent pressure. Jonathan dropped to his knees. Fear had integrated with his body and paralyzed him. His eyes were still fixed on the tooth on the table. At that moment, a weight settled on his shoulder. There was no physical contact, but Jonathan was sure he felt an icy weight on his shoulder. It was as if someone had touched him by freezing the air molecules. And the voice, this time, he heard it not in his mind, but right next to his ear. "You will be one of us too, Jonathan. Come, accept us." Jonathan screamed with all his might and threw himself forward with the last fragments of his will. His footsteps echoed down the corridor behind him. The dying light of his flashlight flickered with every step. He didn't stop, no matter what. He was just running in the direction he came from. Light was the only sign of salvation for him. From the dark depths of cell block B he left behind, the unknown entity watched. It followed him, giggling as if playing a game, yet with a deadly patience. As Jonathan's heart rate accelerated, the shadows seemed to move, and the void waiting at the end of the corridor darkened further. With every breath, every step, the entity became more concrete, trying to pull Jonathan into itself. At that moment, Jonathan was only running, but he was also facing a truth. Every horrific line written in Blackwood's journal had become real here, in these cold and dark rooms, and this cursed reality was pursuing him with all its horror. Fleeing from cell block B, Jonathan ran like a bullet. His lungs burned and his heart hammered as if trying to tear out of his chest. The giggles and whispers behind him were no longer just sounds, but a physical threat. It whispered its terrible past to Jonathan and guaranteed that his future would be worse than the past. Clearly, the entity pursuing him could move not only in space but also in time. Running blindly, Jonathan found himself in a section of the asylum he had not seen before. The medical records room. This place was like the center's nerve network. It resembled a labyrinth filled with metal shelves from floor to ceiling, stacked with thousands of patient files, notebooks, and radiographs. Jonathan stopped, his back against a cold shelf. His goal was just to catch his breath, to escape the devil's momentary pressure. This is not real," Jonathan whispered. The words, still denying the reality, barely left his lips. The tremor in his voice betrayed the depth of his fear. "This is just an illusion, fatigue." But when his eyes fell on the fresh human remains on the table, he realized that neither fatigue nor illusion could explain this being. That tooth was not a metaphor or the product of a dream. The human remains were not scattered around for nothing. This was a physical harm, and it was real. It was deadly in every sense. The entity was both a fear that ruled the mind and a killer with sharp claws. While catching his breath, he glanced at the metal shelves around him. Since medical records were kept here, perhaps he could find the truth about the past. After all, he wouldn't know how to stop this entity without delving into the origins of the past. He rummaged through the shelves until he saw a file signed by Blackwood. Grabbing the papers, he headed toward the wooden reading table on the side. He read aloud what was written on the file stamped with Dr. Blackwood's seal. Jonathan, his hands trembling, turned to the next page. Despite the passing years, the text was surprisingly well preserved. The yellowed edges and slightly rusted corners made him feel the building's history and weight. The drawings, handwritten notes, and diagrams inside dragged Jonathan into the deepest, darkest corners of Dr. Blackwood's mind. The pages of the notebook contained the thoughts of a depraved researcher beyond a mere doctor. Blackwood hadn't just made medical observations. He had pushed the boundaries of the mind and investigated ways to use the energy of fear as a tool. His notes included the theory that the fear in some patients' minds could be a source of energy, even a gateway to other dimensions. The thing I call the entity was the common nightmare of these patients. It is a formless consciousness, the architecture of chaos in their minds. Our goal was to control this chaos and use it for a type of psychic telekinesis. As Jonathan read the sentences, he could clearly see the thin line between Blackwood's genius and madness. The drawings in the notebook showed that fear could take physical form, and that the voids, corridors, and even objects in the rooms could be filled with this energy. The black ink lines, complex geometric shapes, and the deformation of body parts seemed to emit a wave of terror. Jonathan's eyes were drawn to one of the notes on the pages. It was written that some patients could be physically affected or even completely vanish, depending on the intensity of the fear energy. Blackwood had taken this theory a step further. He aimed to create his own experimental entity by playing with fear and unconscious energy. Jonathan took a deep breath and whispered, "Then, everything is true. It is real, and is after me." He shivered as he read the truths. His brain began to fill with whispers again. His eyes blurred as he learned the bitter truth behind Blackwood's experiments. This mad doctor had torn his patients apart for his own purpose and caused their souls to be trapped forever. Although he uncovered many truths, he still hadn't fully learned what happened to patient 412. He turned back to the shelves to find the patient's medical records. He shone his fading flashlight. Nothing was visible between the shelves, but every file on the shelves was pulled out by 1 centimeter. It was barely noticeable at first, but as Jonathan realized it, he understood that every file was being shifted as if stroked by an invisible hand. This was a show the entity pursuing him was putting on. Jonathan decided to play along with the devil's game. It was impossible anyway to defeat it with his own methods. He pulled out a conspicuous file. Written on it in capital letters was Patient 412. The entity had given Jonathan the information he wanted with its own hand. He excitedly opened the file. The documents inside showed that 412 was a young woman who suffered from severe hallucinations and constant fear regarding an entity she called the void inside. On the last page was 412's death report: self-harm and blood loss during isolation. However, at the bottom of the report was a note scribbled in red pen by Dr. Blackwood: "Not death. Fusion. Fear has finally found a channel." As Jonathan tried to digest what he had learned, the Blackwood experiments file he had placed on the table slowly closed. The room had distinctly come alive. Files were hanging from the edges of the shelves, and the rustling of the papers turned into dozens of whispers. As the whispers gained clarity, the truth came to light. He is not alone, Jonathan. We are 412. We are everyone here. Patient 412 was the devilish entity's gateway to the world. She was the body that connected it to life. The doctor had failed in his experiment and caused everyone to die. That was because this entity was not satisfied with patient 412's body. It had haunted all living beings. It was the living manifestation of hunger and fear. Jonathan scanned the room through the flying papers. A dim shadow appeared at the far end of the corridor formed by the shelves. The shadow figure absorbed the nearby light, leaving no hope for life in its wake. The red eyes began to walk toward Jonathan. There was no sound of footsteps. It moved as if gliding through the air. Jonathan held his breath. He could no longer run. Escape from the shadow in this labyrinth full of papers was impossible. As the shadow approached, Jonathan's mind filled with sharp pain. It felt as if something was growing inside his skull. The pain was physical, but its source was his mind. The entity was penetrating his soul. The figure stopped suddenly when it was just a few meters away from Jonathan. With its intensity and presence, it chilled the air around it, literally creating a void within the room. Jonathan noticed a blurry yet familiar silhouette within the shadow. This body belonged to a woman. As the figure slowly raised his hand, it absorbed all the light in the room. Jonathan was plunged into complete darkness. He could no longer see where the entity next to him was. He had never felt such fear in his life. Death was coming for him. But not knowing where and when it would come was terrifying, though he thought it was shameful. His eyes filled with tears. His voice was trembling and tiny sobs escaped his mouth. Just as he was huddled in despair, he heard a sound and completely accepted his end. The woman's figure he had seen earlier was screaming with all her might, holding the agony of hundreds of souls within her body. Even though Jonathan covered his ears tightly, the scream was coming from his mind. There was no escape from this outcry that strained his veins. The devilish entity had embraced his soul, not his body. He was being torn apart and bleeding internally. The scream was broken by a few meaningful words. "We waited for you, Jonathan. Belong to us. Let us belong to you." Jonathan didn't even notice he was kneeling. His own scream of terror filled the room. He had now become a part of Blackwood's chaos. Darkness had never just meant the absence of light. It was also the fragmentation of hope and the guardian of death. Light would not bloom without darkness, and darkness would not exist without light. This was a cycle that completed itself. Jonathan was trapped in this cycle, hearing only his own breathing. Surrendering to the darkness was easy. Simply closing his eyes and letting himself go into the peaceful void was certainly more appealing than fighting. The metal shelves of the records room had completely lost their presence, surrendering to the darkness along with the rusty weight of the years. The rustling of papers, Jonathan's trembling breath, and even the boundaries of his own body were getting lost in this void. Although his feet seemed to be touching the ground, he felt like he was swimming in a black infinity. Jonathan's burning lungs begged for oxygen, and his heart hammered as if it would rip through his chest. Finally, the devilish entity had trapped him. Now it was trying to seep into his body. Jonathan heard the voice, formed by the collective screams of Patient 412 and the others. More than one soul had become a single body. The chorus of terror was celebrating the arrival of death and singing its blood-curdling song. Darkness. How peaceful. Let go, Jonathan. This body, this mind, they are just burdens. When you merge with us, the pain will end. When you are with us, there will be no fear. Jonathan was curled up in a fetal position, clutching his head with his hands. Every word was like a needle stabbing his brain. The entity was promising not fear, but the comforting allure of darkness. For a moment, Jonathan remembered the lines Blackwood had written. It consumes not only our minds, but also the light. Light. Jonathan's flashlight was lost. Its batteries were dead anyway. There was no physical light. But perhaps the light Blackwood was talking about was something else. It was a sprout of will and hope. Jonathan whispered in a hoarse voice, "No." The entity's voice immediately became harsh. The game had turned into a battle. The devil's voice turned into a high-pitched agony. "You have no choice. We are the existence of fear. We are your void." Jonathan gathered all his courage and rage and shouted, "You are nothing. My soul belongs only to me." His words echoed in the darkness like a slamming door. The whispers filling the room paused for a moment. It was then that Jonathan realized the entity fed only on fear and despair. To validate itself, it drove its victims to despair and brought about enslavement through mind games. It was actually a pitiful thing that couldn't inflict physical harm. All it could do was make fear a concrete entity. But fear was not concrete. It was just an illusion hidden in a corner of our brain that occasionally emerged. Jonathan, who declared his own will, had limited the devilish entity's power like a hope that shatters the darkness. Now, fear could not rule him, and it was gradually fading. Jonathan had always been a fearless man, and now, for the first time, he wouldn't surrender to this feeling. A plan formed in his mind. He had to find his recording device. He frantically searched the floor in the dark with his hands. As he crawled on the cold, damp floor, an icy weight again covered his body. The entity was touching him again. "Surrender," it whispered into his face, its voice like millions of dead breaths. Jonathan wrinkled his face and turned his head, his fingers hitting a metal object. The recording device that had fallen from his bag was now in his hand. The entity hadn't understood what he was trying to do. It continued to maintain its pressure with all its might. Jonathan pressed the record button and heard the familiar mechanical click. Immediately afterward, he raised his own voice to drown out the chorus in the room. He had only one purpose in coming to Blackwood, to tell a story. "I am Jonathan," he yelled. His voice was trembling but determined. "I am in Blackwood, and the entity here is a lie. It is merely an echo of old pain and madness. You are nothing. I won't record you. I won't tell your story. I will forget you. From now on, you won't be able to approach anyone, including me." Jonathan's voice created a shockwave in the pitch-black darkness the entity controlled. The devil sustained its life by instilling fear in the minds of others. Jonathan's denial was its greatest weapon. The darkness began to tremble violently. Files descending from the shelves created a whirlwind in the center of the records room. Whispers and screams turned into a deafening chaos. The devilish entity was going mad with the agony of being denied acceptance. Jonathan held the device to his ear and listened to the recording. The device only picked up static noise. The devil was not physical. It was a psychological noise created by fear. Jonathan understood he would win this battle. To make his final move, he pressed the play button on the recording device. He had recorded his own voice when he first entered the building. Still an incredibly silent place. It's as if the building has absorbed even the energy of sound. Jonathan's own voice drew a reassuring curtain of logic over the devil's chaotic screams. The violent storm in the records room suddenly stopped, like a balloon deflating. The absolute darkness around Jonathan slowly began to dissipate. A light, blurry at first but then sharpening, stung Jonathan's eyes. The windows of the room where he had been curled up in pain moments ago were illuminated with light. He checked every corner of the records room. The shelves were still cluttered, but the devilish entity was gone. The paper storm on the wall had ceased. The giggles from cell block B had stopped. Jonathan slowly stood up. He was exhausted. His nose and ears were bleeding, but at least his mind was clear. The fear was gone. The only thing left was Blackwood's old, abandoned walls. He dared not go back to Dr. Blackwood's office. He also refused to return to cell block B. Yes, he was a brave man, but this was enough for him. He didn't run as he walked back. He descended the stairs and reached the heavy, rusty steel door. He opened the door and stepped out into the bright world outside. The sun hadn't yet reached its peak when Jonathan got into his car after crossing the grounds. He turned the key and the engine sputtered to life. Jonathan looked back at Blackwood's door one last time. He had spent his entire night suffering inside this magnificent building. Leaving the building behind, he turned his eyes to the road. A few meters later, he heard a faint sound in the back seat. It was not a whisper, a scream, or a giggle. It was a very low breath. Jonathan looked into the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, but the mirror's surface was momentarily covered in a red glow. Jonathan slammed on the gas, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The red pair of eyes he saw in the rearview mirror belonged to none other than himself. The devilish entity was no longer trapped in Blackwood's dark corridors. It had settled inside Jonathan. When Jonathan returned home, he decided not to publish the podcast. The only evidence of that night in the abandoned asylum was these audio recordings. Still, every night, just before falling asleep, he heard that faint breathing sound right next to his ear, and in a corner of his mind, the word written with Dr. Blackwood's red pen echoed, W